Don't report it?
They said go about your life as usual, and then, huh? Right?
Yeah.
And then they're like, well, if you get caught, then, you know, we didn't know what to do, is our response. Lynn says that she doesn't believe it's applicable to us. And then, so.
Okay, hello everyone.
My accountant says, right, if you're taking grant money.
Want to get started?
Grant money for like administration. You know, or something that's not used up, but you're taking grant money and you're paying your.
Okay, welcome everyone.
So there's
Thank you for all coming, making the extra effort, driving through the snow to make it here tonight. And this is the fourth public workshop that we've had to talk about the groundwater contamination problem in the South Y area. What we plan on doing tonight, and what this workshop is about, is to give you all an opportunity first to get a brief update as to what the water agencies are doing as far as their current activities, and also the activities of the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board with respect to this problem. Also, as part of this workshop, the Desert Research Institute will be presenting or providing us a presentation describing the groundwater model which they developed to help us find a best solution for this groundwater contamination problem. And then at the end of the workshop, we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A where I think we have index cards up here at the up by the sign-in sheet and such for questions. And I'd like to table all those questions till the end of the presentations, and then we'll have 15, 20 minutes or so for Q&A so that you can provide us questions, directly to the agency staff that are involved with this work, and then also directly to the modelers that have been doing the modeling work for this project. On our panel to help answer questions tonight, we have John Teal, our general manager, is with us. We have Jennifer Lukens, the assistant manager for Luken Brothers Water Company. Kirk Woolrich, the general manager for TKPOA. Myself, Scott Ferguson is here from Lahontan. There's Scott. And Susan Rybarski, who will be giving the presentation on the groundwater modeling work. Susan? Okay, again, this is the fourth workshop. So where have we been? So we started this in February of last year. And at that first workshop, this was just before the district received a grant to do the South Y feasibility study from the State Water Board. So what we talked about at that first workshop, we talked about what is PCE. As you may recall, PCE is a solvent that was used in the 1960s and in the 1970s. It was used at dry cleaner facilities. It was also used as a degreaser in metal shops and auto shops, quite widely used. And we talked briefly about groundwater, kind of just the general groundwater, the size of the plume, what we thought was the size of the plume, and just general things about the occurrence of the groundwater plume. We also talked a little bit about what we planned on doing with the grant money that we were receiving with the state water from the State Water Board, and Luken Brothers and Tahoe Keys also presented as far as the items that they were working on outside of the grant to help take care of this groundwater problem. And then we gave a brief overview of the South Y feasibility study as kind of what the next steps would be. And we talked about that. And the next step after that meeting was a pre-design investigation, which was conducted in the mid-plume section, or in the midsection of the contaminant plume during this past summer. So during the second public workshop in August, again, we provided updates from the water agency representatives in Lahontan as far as their current activities and progress on the problem. We presented initial findings from the pre-design investigation from that groundwater investigation that was done in the summer. And then in November, we had another workshop where we again provided updates from the agency and the Regional Water Board. And then Sachi Itagaki from Kennedy Jenks, who is the lead for the feasibility study, talked a little bit about the different types of alternatives that were being developed or were developed and were being used, or the model would be used for evaluation of those alternatives. So that brings us to where we are today. And so we will, again, as part of the workshop today, again, we'll get updates from the agency and the Water Board, and then we'll have Susie talk about the modeling evaluation of those alternatives, which we first introduced in November. Okay, so just for those of you, if this is your first meeting or the first workshop that we've had on the South Y plume, here's a cartoon that shows the inferred extent of the contaminant plume. Let me see if no, that didn't work. Sue? I couldn't find my pointer. Okay, all right, well, I guess maybe I'll do it this way. Okay, well, here's the outline of the contaminant plume. The plume covers an area of about 400 plus acres. The prime contaminant of concern is, again, PCE, tetrachloroethylene. It has a drinking water standard or maximum contaminant level in drinking water of 5 parts per billion, which is somewhat equivalent to about 5 drops of water in a swimming pool. And this contaminant plume has impaired a number of private and public water system wells. There have been 5 wells that have been shut down, and there have been 3 wells more recently that have been, 2 wells that have more recently been closed and shut down for waiting for wellhead treatment to get those back online. Actually, I think only one of those wells are going to be put back online, but Jennifer will tell you more about that. And as far as what the impact is of this contaminant plume on the community's water supply is that it's reduced our available water production capacity by about 3.25 million gallons per day. So that's enough water to supply about 5,000 average households in California. So for a community our size of less than, if you take in the county population as well, maybe we're 25 to 30,000 people. That's a pretty big hit. Okay, so Jennifer's going to talk a little bit about Lucan Brothers and.
Thank you, Ivo, and thank you everybody for coming tonight and for participating. It's really important and actually critical for our community that we have public participation in these meetings. So I'll just review really quickly what Lucan's has done historically and where we're at today. In the summer of 2014 is when we had our initial detections over the MCL at Lucan's wells 2 and 5. We immediately shut those wells down and opened our emergency intertie with South Tahoe PUD. So currently Lucan's operates our well number 1 and intertie with South Tahoe PUD to offset water need, I guess, or water usage, and to ensure that all of our customers receive clean, reliable, safe drinking water that meets all drinking water standards. And it's really important that everybody in our community knows that every customer in Tahoe receives safe, reliable drinking water that meets all drinking water standards. We work really hard as water providers to provide that to you and ensure that everyone is safe. There's my disclaimer. And in May 2015, we completed a preliminary engineering report to determine what the best remedial alternative is for our sites, wells 2 and 5. We determined at that time that GAC, which is granulated activated carbon filtration system, at well number 5 would be sufficient water capacity to operate our water system with well number 1 and shut down the intertie. And at that time, we chose to seek replacing well number 2. So we were awarded in July 2017 a planning grant to start the design and engineering of the GAC filtration plant, which is ongoing currently. We're getting ready to submit our final plans, and we're in the process now of getting grant funding to install the filtration system. In 2018, we received approval from the California Public Utilities Commission to seek funding for this project. In 2018, we did a round of testing with part of the Prop 1 funding and partially funded by Lukens on well number 5, and we had test results of 58 parts per billion and 60 part per billion of PCE in the well, so it's a substantial increase. And then also in June, we were awarded a grant award for the GAC filtration system at well number 5. So we're working through that process right now. At this time, the state is going to begin routing, which is developing the actual funding agreements. Anticipated construction this year to begin, we're hoping for June. And with the help of our partners, with the regional board, we're hoping to expedite the application and maybe start sooner than that. And that's still where we're at. Our next steps are hopefully construction. Thank you. Oh, I'll switch this for Tahoe Keys.
Good evening. Thank everybody for coming. I'm Kirk Wooldridge from the Tahoe Keys Property Owners Association. I'll give you a little bit of a historical background of where we stand with our water company. As you can see, in 2009, we had our initial detection that we were over the MCL for PCE in our well number 2, and we had to shut that well down. As a result of that, we went through planning and development, and we installed a GAC filtration system to well 2. That filtration system does limit our pumping capacity, but we still have 3 wells that serve our demand for our customers. But that GAC filtration treats the water, and we have no detection of PCE. That GAC filtration system cost up to $500,000. Up until this point, and currently, we've been unable to secure or identify any grants that we've been able to apply for and successfully obtain. Part of the reason for that is we are not considered a disadvantaged community. With that said, in 2016, we had our initial detection in well 1 of PCE, but is below the MCL. So we are now currently monitoring that monthly, which is over and above the requirement of the Division of Drinking Water. So we monitor that monthly and test it monthly during the months of May through October when we're utilizing that well to keep track of the PCE. And at this point, it's stayed at a current level below the MCL. In 2017, our board of directors proactively hired an engineering consulting firm, also Kennedy Jenks, who's involved in many of these plans, to develop a facilities plan to address the contamination and to provide alternatives for the future for safe and reliable drinking water for the Tahoe Keys. They did put that plan together, and have identified many alternatives, of which we're still exploring. In the fall of 2018, we also got approval from our board of directors to perform water quality monitoring on well 2, that's our deepest well, to determine the vertical extent of the PCE. That project is still under review, and we've had a few setbacks on deployment, but we're still moving forward with that. So as of 2018, between the GAC and also the facilities plan, we've spent $789,000 on our PCE issue without any grant funding, all paid for by the Tahoe Keys property owners. With that said, we are moving forward, as you'll see tonight, with the DRE groundwater model to determine what potential alternatives we may be able to identify in our facilities plan to move forward to continue to improve our system and meet our demand. In addition to that, we've also added one other improvement to our water system this season in 2018 and spilling over into 2019. We've also added a generator to our well number 3 to respond for any emergency situations that we have. And that is our update. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Scott Ferguson. I'm a supervising engineer for the Lahontan Water Quality Control Board. We're a state agency responsible for water quality protection and, when necessary, such in these cases, actively seeking restoration of water quality and the beneficial uses that that water provides us. Tonight, I'm going to just provide a brief update on what our involvement with this situation is. Be talking about the former Lake Tahoe Laundry Works site, and where we do have cleanup and abatement order on responsible parties there. Looking at a couple of water board investigations that are about to get going here, and also some of the coordination and public information sharing activities, such as this evening's event that we've been participating in. As I said, back in 2017, we issued a cleanup and abatement order to responsible parties associated with the former Lake Tahoe Laundry Works site, which is part of the Rayleigh's Shopping Center complex near the Y intersection of Highway 89 and 50 here in town. That primarily requires them, they've detected PCE contamination on that site. It requires them to look outward and determine the full lateral and vertical extent of that contamination as it is migrated off-site. It also, in doing that, the most recent work that they've been doing has been this past fall and winter, and they've moved out across Highway or Lake Tahoe Boulevard and across and behind, like say, Big O Tire onto Tucker, and they're looking at the soil characteristics, groundwater characteristics, and the contamination moving forward. They're also looking at preferential pathways, so utility lines, stormwater pipelines, sewer lines, the bedding material, the trenches, those can all form ways that the groundwater likes to move more quickly and carry the pollutant, and that could have an effect on how fast the pollution or the contaminant can move. So we're having them evaluate that also. As part of this investigation, they meet with us when they're doing active field work with us on a weekly basis, keeping us up to date on what their results are and what the next steps will be. And they will also be producing they're required to produce a report, technical report every 6 months, summarizing what they've been doing, the results of what they've been doing, and what they plan on doing as next steps looking out. They're basically to follow the pollution that has migrated, determine the extent of that pollution that's migrated from their site out to 0.5 parts per billion, and where the drinking water standard, or the MCL, is 5 parts per billion. So that's the order and what it requires. Also, they do have an on-site treatment system. They're required under this order to continue operating that. And then eventually, they'll be required, determining on the findings of this investigation, to develop and implement a corrective action plan to clean up and abate any pollution that has migrated off their site. So we work regularly. We have significant resources dedicated to following up and making sure that this order is followed and that they're complying with it. And we're also doing our own investigative work. So in the past, there have been a lot of site-specific, localized investigations over the years, but there's yet to be a single comprehensive characterization of the entire contamination, or the plume. So we have funding from the State Water Resources Control Board to go forward, and we are looking to do a very comprehensive characterization of the pollution or the contamination, also the soil characteristics underground, the groundwater characteristics, to get a better idea of how is this moving and where may it be going, and what additional water supply infrastructure may be at risk. We're also looking to take steps where it may also help us identify other potential sources out there. As you heard Ivo say, dry cleaners historically have used this material, and auto shops and auto repair, metal shops, and over in the, as many of you know, probably like in the Eloise 5th, 6th, 7th Street area, we have a lot of light industry over in there, auto shops and things like that. That's also the area where South Tahoe PUD did their pre-design work, field work, back in the summer of 2018. So we're going to launch into this. We're very excited, actually, to get this full picture. That's what we're hoping to come away with. It'll also help the water districts be able to better manage and protect their existing infrastructure. We're anticipating it may help identify and contribute to the idea. You've heard Lukens Brothers is looking at replacing well number 2. Hopefully we'll gain some information that will help them identify good locations. So a lot of interaction between all of these activities that you're hearing about. And one other thing that we're looking at is doing also what we're calling a potential source investigation. And it's a two-tier one, where we're seeking information from a wide variety of current and past businesses and landowners that we have reason to believe may have had products, stored products, used products, disposed of products with PCE in them. We also have a handful where we know that there has been historically PCE contamination, maybe some cleanup, but we have reason maybe now to believe there might be additional work that needs to be done. So we'll be reaching out to those parties as part of this. It is likely that some of the information we receive in this potential source investigation will also help us refine our field activities associated with what's shown up there as the SCAP funded investigation, or the State Water Resource Control Board investigation. And then with all these moving parts and activities and parties that are involved, coordination is critical. And we are coordinating regularly with the water districts. We also are meeting with the responsible parties associated with the former Lake Tahoe Laundry Works facility site. Our coordination with the water districts, as Jen alluded to, we have played a minor role. Lukens Brothers has done really all the heavy lifting in trying to obtain funding, grant funding, but occasionally we can, it's our parent agency that they're working with, so we can act and help assist sometimes on moving things through the process if they stagnate a little bit. So that's one of our roles. Planning and preparation, we don't want to be tripping over each other or duplicating each other's efforts out there. So there is planning and preparation in what we're doing out there and talking about how it can feed into each other. And then communications is critical again, really doing a better job of information sharing. As you'll probably pick up, there's interrelationships between all these activities. They're all feeding in more data, increasing our knowledge of what's going on there, and we're all looking to get a very good, solid solution that allows the water purveyors to continue to provide the safe drinking water supply that they have done an excellent job of doing so. We're looking at having technical meetings with all the parties in the same room, and again, to facilitate that information sharing, generation of ideas, solutions, and then the quarterly public meetings. This is one of them. South Tahoe PUD has been taking the lead so far and plans on providing at least one more as part of their feasibility study project. Once that is over, it is our intent as the LaHunt Water Board to pick up the responsibility and continue holding these meetings, because it is critical that we keep you all informed of what's going on and give you an opportunity to keep yourselves educated, rather than a lot of the times when we don't have the knowledge we need, it generates a lot of fear, anxiety, and we're doing our best to provide the opportunity to alleviate a lot of that and let you know so that you can make good decisions and, again, alleviate a lot of the stress and fear that comes from not knowing what's going on. So I believe that is it for me.
I'm going to pass out some question cards if folks have any.
Okay. Should I go ahead? All right, so I'm Susie Rybarski from DRI, and I did the groundwater modeling of the management scenarios that we've been discussing. So I'm going to go through the results of all those models, but before I do that, I'm going to just go over, some of the basic information about groundwater and how models work, just to make sure everyone's on the same page so we can all understand what these results really mean. So first, what is groundwater, right? It's water that's under the ground, obviously. It's water that's frequently trapped in pore spaces between, grains of sand, clay, silt. It can also be inside fractures in bedrock, or if we've got a limestone carbonate system, it can be, some eroded cavities where this water can flow through. And the movement of the water through the subsurface is governed by aquifer properties, which means, we call it hydraulic conductivity or permeability, and it basically just means the ability of that matrix to transmit water. So sometimes groundwater is trapped and we can't get it out, and sometimes it can flow, just like it would on the surface. So in general, groundwater flows from areas of recharge to areas of discharge. So in this area, we get rain or snow, and some of that rain or snow infiltrates into the ground, and then it flows. Some of it we pump out into wells, and then that water gets used to irrigate or drink, and then the rest of it ends up flowing out into Lake Tahoe. I'm sure you've heard the term an aquifer. An aquifer is just an aquifer is groundwater. It's basically groundwater that we can access, and it can be developed efficiently enough where it's physically and economically feasible to get that water out. So as far as contaminant transport, we want to know how this PCE is moving along with the groundwater. And there's a few terms we need to know. One is advection. That's the primary method of transport. So if this groundwater is flowing through the aquifer from that point of recharge to the point of discharge, contaminants generally move along at the same rate that that groundwater is flowing, the average velocity of the groundwater. But there are some other methods. One is what we call dispersion. And so if you look at my, do I have a pointer? Did we figure out how to make that work? Well, I'll just go over here. All right, so advection, we're moving along with the average velocity of groundwater.
Yes, Susan. People were live streaming, so
Oh, okay.
you kind of have to stay for
Okay. All right, sorry guys. Dispersion, you know, this water is flowing, it's following fracture networks, it's moving between pores, around grains of sand, whatever the aquifer is made of. And so that water isn't necessarily flowing in a straight line, right? It's moving around and it's getting spread out. So when we start looking at some of these simulation results later, you'll see that happen as this plume develops. It'll be moving generally to the north, but it'll also start expanding laterally as it goes, and that's because of dispersion. And then another thing that we need to think about is decay. So there's a lot of microorganisms that live in the subsurface, and they like to munch on some of these contaminants that get down there, and some of them like to snack on PCE, and so they'll break that contaminant down and break it down into some other constituents that are not PCE. And so in a way, if those microorganisms are down there, then they take care of some of that plume for us. And you'll see some of the plume reducing in size as that process occurs as we look at the model results. So what is a groundwater model? Basically, it's just a simplified representation of an aquifer system, a real aquifer system. And so we can use that to simulate past and existing conditions so that we can learn more about the aquifer. We can use it to predict future aquifer responses to modeled inputs like water level declines from pumping. And we can also use it to predict the fate and transport of contaminants or other groundwater constituents. So for the models that I'm going to be showing you here in a minute, we're actually doing both of those last two things. We're predicting future aquifer responses because we are simulating pumping in these models. So we'll see water levels declining around those areas, and the pumping will control how the plume moves through the aquifer to an extent. And then we're also predicting where that plume is going to migrate to. So the model that I'm presenting was created using ModFlow and MT3DMS. So it's a groundwater flow model and then a groundwater transport model that are kind of joined together to show us where the plume will go based on how water is flowing in the aquifer. How groundwater models are created. So we look at reality and then we simplify that into a grid or a mesh that we can then divide into layers. And each of those cells in the grid is given a characteristic that describes the aquifer. So as water passes through each of those grid cells, it'll do so based on how well that grid cell is allowed to transmit water. Then we apply sources and sinks to the model. So that's the recharge that I mentioned earlier, the rain or the snow that recharges the groundwater. We also apply well pumping and we'll put in surface water. So we've got some stream flow and we're also simulating the lake. So when we develop a groundwater model, we start out with some assumed model parameters, and we generally have to adjust them because we want our model to match what's really happening, right? So we know what water levels are across the basin. We can measure the groundwater levels from wells, and we also know PCE concentrations in wells across the basin, and we want our model to match what we've observed as best we can. So we change model parameters until those water levels and those concentrations match what we've seen. So we'll start out running a model from the past and letting it move to the present so that we can see that it does that before we proceed with running a future predictive model. So that's what I'm showing here in these images. You can see these are just some example images. They're not anything real, but you know, we're looking at concentrations of PCE on the y-axis and then time on the x-axis. And so that line, the solid line, is showing the simulated results from the model. And then the dots are showing observed concentrations of PCE, right? So if our model results are showing concentrations that are way lower than what we've seen in reality, then we know that that's not right. We'll have to change something in the model until we see a good fit, a good match. And of course, it's never going to be perfect, right? Because we don't know where every single grain of sand in that aquifer is. But we just have to get it as calibrated as well as we can. So this is going to show, before you start it, hold on. Okay, so this is going to show the results of the model going from 1971 to present. And it's going to show, so you'll see down in the Y area, you'll see this plume begin to emerge, and it's going to be green. What it's showing is where the model is predicting PCE greater than 5 micrograms per liter, which is the drinking water limit. So you're going to see it start to expand. It'll spread in all directions at first, and that's because of that dispersion. But then it's primarily going to start moving north because of the advective transport. So that's the direction that the groundwater is flowing. It's going from south to north. And you'll also see, you can see this well, the Clement well, near the Y area. You'll see as this plume progresses, it kind of starts moving towards that well, and it's when that well gets turned on in the late 80s, early 90s. And so it's grabbing that PCE and pulling it over. All right, so let's play that. So there it goes. And you can see that bulge come out around the Clement well. All right, and this is what the model is currently simulating for the present time period. This is where we're seeing PCE concentrations greater than the drinking water limit. All right, so that's what we're starting out with. Now we need to look at the potential management scenarios. So we're going to be running this model into the future now. So I'm going to show 4 different scenarios, and then we can compare them and see what maybe would be the best way to proceed. So the first scenario is what we're calling the no action scenario. Mostly we ran this one just to have a basis of comparison for the other scenarios. We want to see how well, like, you know, would this have happened anyway if we didn't do anything? We needed something to compare to. Scenario 2, we placed a row of 21 shallow extraction wells, pumping them at 40 gallons per minute. And they're just going to run for 20 years. And we're going to see what that does to the plume. Scenario 4 is to replace some of these existing production wells. So we're moving pumping that's currently at Tahoe Keys 1 to a replacement well that's to the east of the plume. We're trying to move it to wells that are outside of that plume area. And then part of the pumping from Lucan Brothers 5 is also being moved to a replacement well east of the plume. And then scenario 5, we'll be taking advantage of the treatment capacity of some of the existing wells. So we would just increase pumping at Tahoe Keys 2 and Lucan Brothers 5 up to 90% of their treatment capacity. And reduce pumping at the South Tahoe PUD wells. So when we increase all that pumping at Tahoe Keys and Lucan Brothers wells, what do we do with that water? So it's basically then would be distributed by South Tahoe PUD through their distribution system. All right, so this is that first scenario, the baseline no action scenario. So on the left, what you're seeing is the current results. That's that last frame of the video that we just saw. And then on the right is the result of the no action scenario 20 years in the future. So this is 2038. And you can see that the plume has gotten a lot smaller, right? So what happened to it? We didn't do anything. Well, the answer is that we kind of did do something, because all of these wells, all of these production wells that you can see with the red dots, are still pumping at their normal rates during this time period. So some of that mass got pumped out by these wells. And then another thing that's happening is that biogenic decay. Those microorganisms were snacking on that PCE. And so it just kind of reduced the size of the plume. Also, what we're seeing here is just where the PCE exceeds the drinking water limit. So if we have any kind of dispersion where that plume is moving outward, the concentrations are getting smaller. So now they're not being plotted anymore because it's just not showing up. It's below the drinking water limit. So for the next scenarios, what I'm going to be showing is just comparing everything to this image on the right. We want to see how these scenarios compare to what would happen if we didn't do anything. So scenario 2 is the extraction well scenario. We put in 21 extraction wells. That's these blue dots on the image here, just across where the plume exceeds the drinking water limit. So the goal is just to remove PCE mass. And these wells are all pumping, as I said, at 40 gallons per minute. And then all the production wells in this area are just pumping at the same rate that they were in that no action baseline scenario, so that we can compare these accurately. So on the left is the result of that no action scenario for 2038. And on the right is the result of the extraction well scenario for the same time period, 2038. So you can see the plume has gotten smaller. We've pumped out some of that mass. And you can also see that it hasn't moved as far, and it's gotten a lot skinnier and longer. And it's because those extraction wells, which I don't know if you can see where they are, they're kind of covered up by Lucan Brothers 3 down there, they're light blue dots. They're changing how the water is flowing through the aquifer. They're changing the velocity that water is flowing through the aquifer, and so the plume is kind of being held back by those wells. So in this scenario, we have about 135 kilograms of PCE removed by the extraction wells, and 113 is removed by the production wells, which we're pumping anyway. So that would be like Lucan Brothers 5, Tahoe Keys 2 that are still inside that plume. The declines in the concentrations of the production wells are pretty minimal compared to the no action scenario. And it's because those extraction wells are kind of holding that plume where the production wells are. It's keeping it from moving beyond those extraction wells, or beyond those production wells. So scenario 4 is the replacement well scenario. We're trying to move our pumping outside of that plume area to see what will happen if we do that. So the goal is just to pump water from an uncontaminated aquifer zone. So for this one, we moved pumping from Tahoe Keys 1 to replacement well D. Hopefully you guys can read it. Tahoe Keys 1 is that one up north, and it's moving to the southeast. And then we're moving half of Lucan Brothers 5 pumping to this replacement well F over here. And then all other production wells are being pumped at just their standard baseline rates. So this is the result from that. So on the left, we have the 2038 baseline no action result. And on the right, we have the results from moving that pumping to the replacement wells. So you can see that the north-south extent of the plume didn't really change that much. But what did happen is that it kind of spread to the east, right? And it's because we've increased pumping to the east. So we're drawing that plume to the east. So we've actually ended up expanding the footprint of that plume with this scenario. There's very little effect on concentrations at Tahoe Keys 2 and Looking Brother 5. And similar to the extraction well scenario, we end up actually retarding the migration of the plume a little bit, and we're also spreading that plume to the east. So the final scenario, scenario 5, is the max supply well pumping scenario. So this is where we've tried to really ramp up the pumping at Lucan Brothers 5 and Tahoe Keys 2. We're pumping them at 90% of their treatment capacity. So this is basically a pump and treat, if anyone's heard that phrase before. And then that excess water is going to be used by South Tahoe PUD. So they'll reduce their pumping. And so some of their wells are included in this model. And so that'll affect how this plume is migrating as well. So these are the results from this one. So on the left, again, is that baseline no action scenario. And then on the right is the result from pumping those two wells just as hard as we can, basically. And you can see it's drastically reduced the footprint of the plume. It is kind of holding it back a little bit, but we've removed a lot of mass in this scenario. So for this one, it's the greatest amount of mass extraction over all the scenarios that we ran, 330 kilograms. It also tends to protect Tahoe Keys 1. It keeps that plume from migrating over towards Tahoe Keys 1 in the north, and reduces the concentration at that well. And it greatly reduces the plume footprint. So overall, scenario 2, the extraction well scenario, tended to retard the plume migration away from the production wells. So it kind of held that plume back and kept it in the area of those production wells. Scenario 4, replacement wells actually ended up, although those replacement wells themselves were reasonably safe, they ended up pulling the plume further east than it would have moved otherwise. And then scenario 5 showed a lot of promise for removing the greatest amount of mass and results in the largest reduction of plume area. I think that's all I've got. All right, move on to questions.
We'll take a quick 5-minute break and folks can write down their questions and I'll walk around with the basket to put them in. And then we'll give all the questions up to divvy up the questions to the presenters and go from there.
Really good.
think we are going to get back rolling again. Feel free to grab an orange, coffee, sugar before you sit. We've passed out questions to the appropriate folks, and they'll go ahead and start us off. You want to start with Eva?
Okay. So I have three questions here. First question I received, is it possible to add more of the microorganisms that feed on the PCE? What would be the side effects of introducing these organisms? That's a very good question. So the way that this process is working, Kennedy Jenks consultants, the engineering consultants, one of their specialties is remediation and remediation strategies for groundwater cleanups. And they have looked at using microorganisms as an alternative. What's going to happen as far as the next step is with the results of the modeling, they're going to select and from their research into different approaches for remediation, they're going to select 3 alternatives that they are going to fully cost out. And then we'll be able to provide information as far as the top 3. And we hope to roll that out to in our last workshop before or as we're approaching the recommended alternative at the end of April or early May. So we'll have more answers and more about, we'll see whether microorganisms are in the mix of the remedial approach or not. I don't believe that they will be, but again, it's something that they have looked at, but I don't want to speak for Kennedy Jenks. How much do each of these scenarios cost? If amount not known, which is cheapest, most expensive? Again, that's going to be worked out over the next couple months, and we hope to have answers for you in late April, early March at the next workshop. Has a cost been assigned to each option? If not, when will that be completed? I think we just answered that, so thank you.
Thanks, Eva. I've got one question here. Are there home GAC filters that serve a similar result as the ones installed or being planned in the area? So just to be clear, all the water being served in Tahoe Keys and Lukens at the district, all that is safe drinking water, meets our water quality standards. And in the district, we actually have no detectable PCE anywhere in our system. And I believe Lukens is treating to a non-detect level, so there's no detectable water in the water they're serving. And the Keys, I believe there's maybe trace amounts of PCE coming out of well number 1, but it's below the standard. So your water is safe. There are private wells in the area, and they could benefit from a carbon treatment system. And maybe one avenue is to contact Culligan out of the Reno office. I think they'll come out, test your water, and perhaps offer a system for that. Thanks.
Okay, so the first question I have is, how often does Lukens Brothers Water Company test the active well being used? That well, so the standard for testing for VOCs, which tetrachloroethylene is part of, is every 4 years. But to be proactive, because we do have a highly sensitive situation, Lukens tests that well every year. We also test all the private wells that we are aware of in our system. Because they all lie between what we know where the contamination is and where Lukens well 1 is. So we're kind of using those as makeshift sentinel wells for testing. So we test those every year as well, and all of those have come back non-detect. So just to let you know about that. And then our second question is, approximately how long does it take to clean a contaminated well? Good question. We would all like to know that. But based upon the scenarios that have been run in the model, It greatly depends on how much is being pumped out of that well and treated. So the scenarios that Susie ran or Desert Research Institute ran, it's a 20-year model, and I believe it's scenario 3, right? Is the one where you have the 2 wells pumping max? Oh, that's scenario 5. Okay, so sorry, scenario 5, correct me. Scenario 5, within 20 years, Lucan's well 5 is non-detect. Or below, I shouldn't say non-detect, is below the 5 parts per billion. So that's the information that we have available to us now, which is the first time we've had that, which is very exciting. The second question I'm answering on behalf of Tahoe Keys, just because I have more background in this than Tahoe Keys does. So funding for scenario 5. If Tahoe Keys adds additional GAC to well number 2, to increase its capacity. So is there funding available for that? I believe the question is. So we have recently been speaking with the regional board about funding for remediation of the plume or remediation of the contamination. And there are 2 possible avenues, and that's the Prop 68 funding, and there's also a SCAP fund available. Each have different parameters and require different requirements for the water utility to meet, but there is cleanup fund available, and it is for remediation. So as long as those wells are being retrofitted to meet that, then they do meet the ability to qualify for those fundings. It's a matter of applying for it and going through the process. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So we have about, I don't know, I lost count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cards for me, some with multiple questions. So we'll be here for just a moment. Let's start off with a good one. Why hasn't Lahontan done anything from 2009 to 2017? Well, we have been doing work out there during that time period. It was in 2010 that Lake Tahoe Laundry Works actually brought on their on-site remediation system. And there have been, as you heard me mention earlier this evening, we've been participating in a number of studies and looking at other sources and trying to evaluate impacts. But I would say the key thing that has happened during that time period was the the Lake Tahoe Laundry Works remediation system was brought online and has been operating for quite a bit of that time. So they've actually removed, I believe, and I'll verify with my staff, about 900 pounds of PCE from using their on-site remediation system. So that's quite a bit. Let's see, I'll go, what other businesses have you identified besides Laundry Works? We've, I probably won't hit everybody, but some of the other sites that have been investigated, some have done some source removal, include the Big O, former Big O Tires site, the Napa Auto Parts site. There's also been work over in what I'll call the shopping center area that's now TJ Maxx. There used to be a dry cleaner and laundry works there, or laundry facility there. Those are some of the big ones that we've been working on. And let's go to another one. How is the source of the contaminant being treated? Well, at Lake Tahoe Laundry Works site, they're using soil vapor extraction. So the PCE will put off vapors, and you can pull that off, and that it'll actually come up out of the groundwater also and out of the soil column. And that's the system that's being used at the former Lake Tahoe Laundry Works facility. Follow-up question on this is, will additional source removal affect the plume cleanup? It could. This contaminant likes to depending on the soil characteristics. There's some soils that it really likes to grab onto for a while. And then when concentrations within the groundwater change, reduce, it can then start releasing it back out. So some of our future investigation that I was alluding to could lead to something like that, where we're looking at a possible alternative would be to remove some of the source. And that's part of looking at feasibility studies and stuff, is trying to identify what's going to be the biggest bang for the buck. So that's where the modeling helps us. That's where more of the information that we're going to be hopefully obtaining this summer can also go into refining the model and helping us optimize our approach to tackling this situation. Let's see. At what point will it reach the lake? And what can be potentially done to, I think it says, defer it from reaching the lake? Well, as you saw in a couple of the figures, and as we know, it's already reached a couple of Tahoe Keys wells, and if you look at the location of those wells, those are basically at the lagoons. So you could already say it's there at the lake. Now, is it going into the lake, or is it running under the lake? Because PCE tends to like to sink. So if the ground, it could be running under the lake bottom, we're not sure. The bottom line is we're dealing with, even though some of the concentrations we see are significantly above the drinking water limit, they're still, in the big scheme of things, relatively low. And there is such a dilution factor out there with Lake Tahoe that we don't think that we would be able to detect it at all. So we probably will not see it. We won't be able to measure it in Lake Tahoe if it is in fact already there. And like I said, in the groundwater, it's there at the lagoons already, based on the results we have with Tahoe Keys 1 and Tahoe Keys 2 wells. The one thing on, is there anything we can do to defer it or deflect it or reduce it? You saw on the simulations a number, I'll say 2 or 3 of the scenarios, you saw it pull back away from the lake shore. So there are things we can do, and that's what we're trying to evaluate here in the short term and then going longer term. Let's see. When parties who caused PCE are identified, do they pay for the replacement cost of getting clean water? When will this happen? Excellent question. That's part of our responsibility, and that's part of where we're at right now, is that we don't necessarily have the data that connects any single source to any of the water supply wells. That's part of what our very comprehensive study will be doing, likely shed some light on. That's why we're having the responsible parties with the former Lake Tahoe Laundry Works look at their contamination. We know there's a source there, and the data shows it is migrated off. And in order for us, we do have the authority, when we have the evidence to support this action, we have the authority to require responsible parties to provide replacement water. It's another way of saying cover the cost. We're not there yet, unfortunately. We may never get there. It's very complex geology, hydrogeology. It has been, there could be multiple sources, but that's why we're looking for sources. And when we identify sources and we see who's responsible for those sources, if we can make that connection and then we can link it to the impact to the wells, then that puts us in a very strong position to go after those parties with additional enforcement action that could involve replacement water or paying the cost of some of these treatment systems. When will that happen? I don't want to speculate, unfortunately. I am excited, I'm optimistic that this summer with our SCAP-funded investigation and our other work that we're doing will shed a lot of light on this and then put us in a much better position to take action. And again, help us make informed decisions on how to best go about tackling this overall problem. The PCE contamination has been going on for years. Now Tahoe Keys has 2 contaminated wells. Fixing this could cost millions. When will costs be recovered? I'll put that in the same, I just basically covered that. Okay, we're getting down to the end. Is Superfund dollars available? I'm not aware of any. As Jen alluded to, there are state programs available, and again, we'll do the best we can do to help out with making that happen. But I'm not sure if this would even qualify as a Superfund site. And the LaHunt Water Board does have some experience since we do own our own Superfund site at Leviathan Mine, south of here. But I'm not sure it would qualify in the first place, and that's a US EPA decision. Does PCE have a half-life? I don't know. Does anyone have any? Do you like that one?
I mean, PCE by itself, I don't believe does have a half-life, but the way that we simulate that decay by the microorganisms is in terms of a half-life, so it's kind of a function of the concentration over time. So in our models, it's a half-life of 2 years in the upper layer and, 15 years in the upper layer and 2 years in the lower layers. There's 4 layers in this model. So that's what we're simulating, but it could be different from that. And that's just based on laboratory tests.
What happens if the plume hits Keys Lagoons? Again, I would put that in the same arena as it hitting the lake. I think the concentrations that we're looking at are so relatively low that we're not going to be able to detect it. And then I'll come back to this one. The last one's yours there. And I have one final one. Has plume source moved from Rayleigh's center? Is there risk from excavations 5 feet or less? There's the source, I'll say there's indications that the contamination has moved off what's being referred to as the Rayleigh's center here. There are detections in Lake Tahoe Boulevard. There are high detections over on Tucker, and there are detections moving out across towards the TJ Maxx center. So there are indications that, yes, that this is migrated off-site, and that that's one reason we're having the Lake Tahoe Laundry Works responsible parties tell us just how far it's gone. Is there risk from excavations 5 feet or less? I don't know if I could, really gets down to how I guess you characterize risk. At the Lake Tahoe Laundry Works site, There has been soil vapor studies and done in the shallow soils, and it has not exceeded risk levels there. I personally don't know elsewhere. I know that some of our investigation this summer will include some soil vapor work, and we'll be able to get a better idea on that. So, and then the top one is yours too.
All right, so does water pumped from production wells in scenario 5 get treated before dispersion to public? And does water get dispersed to the public? So yes, in that scenario, the water coming out of Lukens Brothers 5 and Tahoe Keys 2 would be treated before it's distributed. And in that scenario, that water would then get distributed to both of the water companies since they're wells, but that excess water beyond what they can use would then be given to South Tahoe PUD and dispersed through their system. But it absolutely would be treated to below the drinking water standard before being dispersed. Pumping with a filter is below normal of what a well could pump. Does your model take this into account? Yes, it does. All of the pumping rates in the model are either pumping rates that already occurred. The ones going into the future are based mostly on existing rates, except for where we were changing up those rates to run the management scenarios. But in that case, they are based on what could realistically happen at those wells. What was scenario 3? Before we ran all these scenarios, we did just a few quick runs to see how viable they were. We did one where we put in kind of a remediation line. Basically, someone else was asking what would happen if we put microorganisms in there. What it does is basically puts in microorganism food to make them kind of want to come break down that PCE. But it wasn't fruitful, so we didn't run any further simulations with that one. So that's why there was no 3. It just didn't work. And how accurate are your models? That is a great question. So the models do a good job of replicating measured PCE concentrations at wells. In places where there are no wells, where we don't know in reality how much PCE there is, it's really hard to say how accurate that is. That said, we also ran some additional scenarios beyond what I showed you. And so they're the same management scenarios, but they're under what we call conservative conditions. So for those ones, we included 0 biogenic decay, so there's no microorganism breaking that PCE down. And we also had the source continue to bleed additional PCE into the model. So it ends up being way more PCE than, like, we know there's not that much in there, but it gives us kind of bookends so that we can see what's going to happen if we're wrong. What is the worst case scenario? And so we ran models under both of those conditions to kind of deal with that question that we have too.
Thank you guys for getting through them all. Thank you everyone for coming. We will be having another public meeting in a few months' time, which will be advertising just like we did this one. If you were not at our previous workshops and this was so exciting that you want to find out what we talked about, they're all recorded and they're on South Tahoe Public Utility District's website. It's stupid.us and look for the groundwater tab. They're all recorded, so you guys can check those out. And tonight's meeting is recorded too. It will be posted up there within the next week or so. So thanks again for coming. Stay tuned, and these guys are all still available for questions afterwards if you want to corner them. Thanks.